We are therefore fortunate to have with us tonight a scholar whose background and accomplishments make him a reliable source of clarity regarding many difficult things. He has been, for many years, a steady voice of insight and good sense about the politics of the Middle East. Dr. Walid Phares was born and raised in Lebanon and earned undergraduate degrees in public law and political science from St. Joseph Jesuit University and the Lebanese State University, both in Beirut. He then obtained a master's in international law from the University of Lyon in France and a PhD in international relations and Middle East studies from the University of Miami. He has taught in the Department of International Relations and the Department of Religious Studies at Florida International University, and since 1993 he has been a member of the Political Science Department at Florida Atlantic University, where he has won 2 teaching awards. He has taught graduate and undergraduate courses on a great variety of subjects. The conflict in the Middle East, comparative politics of the Middle East, ethnic conflict, the comparative politics of nationalism, politics of the Middle East, among others. He also has taught in the highly successful continuing education program at Florida Atlantic, where he competes with former Massachusetts Governor Michael Dukakis to see who can attract the most students. He is the founder and the faculty advisor of the Florida Society for Middle East Studies. He's published books and monographs on the experience of religious minorities in Muslim lands, the background of the Iranian Revolution, Lebanese Christian nationalism, Lebanese Christian democratic thought, and security matters in the Middle East, particularly those involving the Lebanese, Syrian, Israeli triangle. His work has appeared in the Middle East Quarterly, the Mideast Quarterly, the Journal of Intelligence and Counterintelligence, and Global Affairs. His most recent research and publications have concerned Al-Qaeda, Iraq, and jihad movements in the Middle East and beyond. Dr. Phares has also served as an expert witness in federal court in terrorism cases and is a regular contributor to news programs, including Fox News, CNN, and Al Jazeera. He is one of the few people who have appeared both on Fox News and Al Jazeera on the same subject. And he's a regular Middle East and terrorism analyst with MSNBC, NBC, and CNBC. And finally, since 1991, he has delivered over 400 lectures to professional and community groups on the politics of the Middle East. Please welcome Dr. Walid Phares.
Thank you. Thank you. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Great pleasure, honor, privilege to be with you tonight in this very beautiful campus, reminding me, as my colleague Dennis mentioned, of my first university where I got my first degrees. That is the St. Joseph Jesuit University. I'm a product of the Jesuits as well. I'd like to thank you, Professor Hale. I'd like to thank also the student organizations, including the FDD affiliates who have organized this event. I'd like to thank each one of you who came to this evening encounter. And I'm going to start immediately by making the first comment, because I have taught for about 12 years on American campuses. I have been also a professor of Middle East studies on the other side of the Atlantic, of the Mediterranean, in Beirut. So I have this sort of comparative aspect that I carry with me. I teach comparative, but I have also seen comparative teaching on both sides of the oceans. And that experience by itself is something that impacted my analysis, my research, even my appearances on national TV or on both sides of the language. As Professor mentioned, I do significantly appear in the Western media, including on American TV, but also recently, over the past few months, increasingly on these Arab networks, not just Al Jazeera. And by the way, I just finished this morning the longest interview ever, 1 hour and 20 minutes on Al Jazeera. Crossfire style, meaning, you could imagine, it's very, very loud. The people in the studio, Americans, do not understand Arabic, thought that there was a problem. They thought we were fighting. I said, no, this is the language. This is how you deal with it, which was one of the reasons why a few years ago, a commentator, Thomas Friedman, of course, whom I met in Beirut a long time ago, of the New York Times, was trying to assess the work of Al Jazeera. he said, it looks like one of the programs that shows of CNN. So certainly you have pluralism, you have various ideas clashing. So it's not really a very extremist thing because it's professional. It shows the two sides of it. And guess what? They were shouting. So it means it's democratic. Until I tried to send him the message explaining that they were talking about which theory, which ideology, which mechanism is better to defeat the infidels. So it was not about two different aspects, but one aspect and two tactical angles. For tonight, for the menu tonight, I have two things. One is I would like to make a comment, first of all, about where would this lecture fall in your studies, in the social studies in general, in the general realm. And then I'm going to dive into the actual issue that has to do with policies. And I know I'm under pressure because on the one hand, I'd like to treat these issues under strict academic format, but time is very, very short. So I will use some of the concepts that you are familiar with in nationalism studies and religious studies, if you want to, in Middle Eastern studies. But in fact, what I would like to do is focus on policies, on issues of conflict that basically the professor announced. We do have a problem in Middle Eastern studies. Let me start with this first. In America, it has to do with the past 20 years of how this entire establishment, the teachers like myself of Middle Eastern studies, of all subfields related to Middle Eastern studies, from languages to religions to conflict and so on and so forth, have dealt with basically trying to analyze what was happening, analyze the surfacing, surging currents from the Middle East and reporting them to our establishment. And that would translate into, let me call it, elite thinking materializing in the media, materializing in policy making, and so on and so forth. The problem was that over the past at least 15 years, I'd say after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the analysis of the basic undercurrents in the Middle East, including obviously the ones I'm going to be talking about, such as Islamic fundamentalism, some would call now jihadism, which is a term that has been very popular or unpopular after 9/11, have encountered the problem of, I mean, the perception of these elites of what was happening in the Middle East was impacted deeply by policies, by academic policies, what to consider important, what to consider less important. So if you were students in the 90s, and maybe some among you may have been students in the early 90s, you would see that the focus, the overwhelming focus of Middle Eastern studies was centered around the Arab-Israeli conflict, and specifically around the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, sometimes narrowed to either the peace process or terrorism has to do with that conflict. Because of that over-focus on what should have been, of course, one of the most important, and is one of the most important issues, did something else. It overshadowed, it marginalized other issues, which came to haunt not just Americans, but Middle Easterners all the way since 9/11. That's why, precisely, the major question which was asked about what has happened on 9/11, if you recall, and that's something very close to us, was why do they hate us? Remember that first question in the media, on campuses, everywhere. And it's really intriguing because in comparative politics, if you look at other situations of other nations at war, meaning either engaged in a war or a war was declared against them, that wouldn't have been the first question. The first question would have been, how were they able to do it? Not, why do they hate us? Because the second question that I have looked at as a result of the first question was, who are they? So this is intriguing. Why do they hate us? And then, gosh, there is a they. Then who are they? Then you come to the third question, what do they want? Fourth question, when did they declare that war? And then you go on for further and further into questioning all those signs that were coming to us in the 90s. Why didn't we catch them? So why were we failing in understanding that there was a mounting threat? Why were we thinking that basically those movements or those ideologies basically reflected some other type of threat, where of socioeconomic background or were basically related only to the Arab-Israeli conflict. So because of our focus, ultimate and concentrated focus on the Arab-Israeli conflict, we missed the nature of the Taliban regime. We missed the nature of what will become Al-Qaeda. We missed the nature of the Ba'athist regimes both in Syria and in Baghdad. We missed also, on the other hand, the rise of significant currents such as the student movement in Iran, women's movement in Iran, the minorities. I remember when I used to lecture about the Kurds, mentioned the Kurds in my lectures in the 90s, there was always that face with big eyes open asking the question, who are the Kurds? Now you have 1,000 experts on the Kurds after we moved to Iraq, and the words such as jihad, words such as infidels or kuffars were only understood by the very experts in the field, but not actually by the entire political establishment. And suddenly, after 9/11, and you've seen this, there are 1,000 experts now, too much, too many, appearing everywhere, publishing significantly, more so than in the academic world. I do remember when I was assigned the first class of undergraduate in Middle Eastern Studies, that was in 1991, symbolically in September of 1991. That was 10 years exactly before the 9/11 of 2001. I was impressed because this was my first American class. I'm going to be teaching. I have taught in Beirut, France as well, lectured around the world, and immigrating to this country in 1990, I was under the impression, like any other immigrant, that you're coming to a place which knows everything about the whole world. This is the superpower that has defeated the Soviet Union. So the imagination, the perception from the outside is that many of what we consider as crises and conflicts in the region are general information and knowledge among average citizens here. This is Rome, so everybody knows about it. I asked the first question in the classroom, and this is a real story. I asked the first question, can anybody tell me where is the Middle East? A young man stood up. He said, I know, sir, it's the other side of the Middle West. I knew I had a job in America for a long time. And that is a true story. Now, the follow-up of that story is that this young man ended up being a legislative assistant with a member of a subcommittee dealing with the Near East. So the journey was incredible. And obviously, by the time I met him in Congress years afterwards, he basically grew in his knowledge of the region, and he now basically, I cannot give the name, is one of those who are analysts serving the American government. That was very significant to me, that first encounter with students, because it told me that a government, the US government, both Congress and the administration, any administration, foreign policy agencies, were at the end of the day recruiting from the pool, and the pool are the students. Recruiting to what? Recruiting to being analysts for agencies, being journalists and the big boys networks, CNN, New York Times, so on and so forth, in Congress, in the various levels of administration. So if you would read it historically, you would see that our establishment has been recruiting from pools of students who were receiving education about the Middle East, and I'm not mentioning that case. That is an ultimate extreme case. I'm talking about whatever policies we've developed, Washington has developed. Up till 9/11 were policies which were influenced by elites that have, at the end of the day, been the product, the graduates of classrooms taught by professors, taught by an academic establishment. Now, the research question, and we'll end the introduction here and dive into the body of remarks today. The research question is, everything we've seen in the 90s, all these signs coming from outside, the attacks, first attacks of 1993, World Trade Center, the attacks of Khubar, the coming of the Taliban as a regime in Afghanistan, then the attacks of the 2 embassies in Africa and East Africa, followed by the Cole, USS Cole, into 9/11, plus the speeches and the discourses made by the, let me use a term which I believe you would understand. If not, I will clarify further, by the jihadist movement for the last 10, 12, or 14 years, all these signs coming towards us were basically digested, were basically interpreted to us by this academic / intellectual elite serving their digested information to agencies in government that had to make a decision. This whole introduction aims at what? At trying to explain how, although we've received, according to the 9/11 Commission, findings, and I was very privileged, may I say, that last August or in the summer, when there was a pre-briefing, a phone conference pre-briefing that the 9/11 Commission wanted to start with before announcing to the public the actual findings, the 400 pages, and I'm sure everybody here read the 400 pages. I'm not sure. I was privileged to be part of it. And I was intrigued, and at the same time I understood where the conclusion of the 9/11 Commission reached. Where did they basically told the American public that the reasons, the foundations of the reasons of what has happened to us, to America on 9/11, resides after these 400 pages in one concept. It was the following. Americans, according to the findings of the 9/11 Commission, have had a failure in imagination. For those who read or heard or had the patience of going through the C-SPAN televised hearings, remember that at the end of the day, at the end of the process, through this electoral year, or was not 2004, the conclusion was that we don't know if we were able to avoid, if a 9/11 was to be checked by, understood by our defense, by our policy agencies. It was a failure of imagination. We could not fathom, we could not imagine that this would happen. Well, of course, if you remember, for those among you who were interested in these hearings, there was this incredible footage that really told me a lot. When this F-16 pilot was rushing towards the Pentagon, saw the smoke. Remember what he said. His immediate instinct-based reaction was, God, the Russians had us. That is very important. That is so much telling of what was basically the military doctrine that was taught, what was basically the defense analysis at the time, which was based on a thorough analysis by Middle Eastern studies. The Russians, after 10 years, when the Cold War has ended, 10 years after the collapse of the Soviet Union, were still perceived by our military doctrines, reflecting Middle Eastern studies, that this was the enemy, that there was no other strategic enemy. Another example, just going to rush through these examples and then come to my first point about the war on terror, was when this female FBI officer rushed to her superiors in Washington with information that there are few men trying to train as to how to fly and not to land. And she was dismissed. Now, reactions before 9/11 versus reactions after 9/11 are extremely telling, as not just to the state of government and how they perceived the upcoming threat, but even the state of our political culture. And one of the examples I've factored in my analysis in the book I am writing, one of them is the shoe bomber. Remember the shoe bomber concept? Well, he was, coming from Paris to Miami to basically be able to do a suicide mission that would kill all the passengers on the airliner. Had this happened before 9/11, just projected, had there been a gentleman, weird-looking gentleman, playing with his boots or his shoes before 9/11, what would have been the psychological reaction by most passengers? We don't want to talk to him. He will sue us if we approach him or talk to him if he was doing something. He was not doing something illegal. Now, after 9/11, it wasn't the government that came and stopped him. Every single passenger was all over him. That, in political psychology, is extremely telling. The people, the public, has basically changed. And it changed not because of the education that we had, not because of the amount of information that we have developed or our elites have developed, but because of the single sight, the single picture, the images that we've seen on that day of 9/11. Which leads me now to my point about the war on terror, which would lead us to the war in Iraq and to the latest developments. I mean, when I was planning this lecture, I didn't project that I will be, here talking about the war on terror after the assassination of the former Prime Minister of Lebanon. That by tonight, Syria and Iran have announced that they have formed a strategic alliance. The world has changed over the past 48 hours significantly. So, yes, at the end of my talk, after I talk about the war on terror and on Iraq, and if you wish to ask me questions afterwards, but I would also talk about how now the geopolitics of the Middle East are stretching the crisis into the east, that would be Iran, and into the west of it, that would be Lebanon and Syria. One major problem in the war on terror, to try to state where it is right now, is the definition. We do not have a joint definition of neither what is the war on terror, nor as to how to win the war on terror. I always ask my students in the classroom, first try to define what is the war on terror. Is it a police operation that would aim at finding the terrorists, dismantling the cells, eliminate them if possible in the confrontation, or bring them to justice? Or is it to find the factory, the institution, the mothership that produces the terrorists? And that was the debate which is still ongoing after Tora Bora. You know what Tora Bora was, the last battle face-to-face with Al-Qaeda. Till now, and despite most of the speeches delivered by either the president or congressional leaders or experts here and there, we are hesitant as to deal with the concept of what is actually the war on terror beyond its legal aspect. Now, there were attempts, of course, by intellectuals, think tankers to say, hey, it is not just a war against terror as a concept, or even terrorists, because that is an instrument, it's a weapon. Terrorism is not an ideology. There are no ideology of terrorism that you can find, but terrorism basically is an instrument used by ideologies to attain their objectives. So having said that, what is our state of affairs, state of the union, if you want, state of the war on terror as we speak today, as events are developing, and try to link that to the situation, the developing situation in Iraq. And as you know, tomorrow is going to be a big day in Iraq because they're going to announce the results. Now, announcing the results of elections in any country is not that big of a day except for the candidates or the followers or their friends. But in Iraq, it's going to be of a historical dimension, and I'm going to explain or try to explain why is it. When Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda decided to strike against the United States, that decision was made not on August of 2001, nor the previous 9 months or few years. The actual technical strategic decision to choose the targets, to train the people, maybe around the late 90s, according to the findings of the 9/11 Commission. The strategic decision to move against the United States and to declare war, which was declared in 1998, was in the early 90s. Some of the experts, and I would conclude in the same way, put that date in 1992, end of 1992, after a meeting in Khartoum, capital of Sudan, of most jihadist / fundamentalist organizations in that region of the world, east of the Mediterranean. And the question that is still now to be addressed, why did they decide to declare that war? That is a more important question than why did they decide to basically do the strikes in Washington and in New York. It's why the war to start with. There were explanations which were provided by many experts immediately after 9/11 that tried to link the 9/11 attacks to what we thought were mistakes in United States foreign policy. Meaning, United States policy was wrong. It somewhat triggered a reaction. And Al-Qaeda is basically a reaction to American foreign policy. What the listeners and viewers were not basically equipped to understand was that the ideology behind the organizations that decided to strike the United States, that was born decades ago. It was even born before the emergence of the State of Israel, before the Arab-Israeli conflict. And if you go deep back in history, that ideology and the doctrine, which is the foundation to the ideology, was born centuries ago, even before the formation of the United States. And the United States was perceived, in addition to the fact that it's a superpower, was perceived as an emanation of a very old conflict. And in one of my writings, I have compared the war by the jihadists, by Osama bin Laden, as the wars of the Lord of the Rings. In this case, the Lord may be Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden, but the rings, the actual ideology, is a very old thing. So if we understand it in a very simplistic way, that what we are up against, the United States, the coalition, the international society, including the Europeans, the Arab moderates, the Muslim moderates, and the rest of the world, what we are up against is an ideology that has a world view and that has a systematic, mechanical system of progress. It measures, it has a rationale of its own. These are not emotionally based reactions. We are angry with the Americans, then we come and bring down some of these towers. No, these are calculated moves in a balance of power that is devised and seen by intellectuals, by policy planners, many of the Al-Qaeda people, of the networks that feed these terrorist organizations. Many of these guys have the same degrees from the same institutions. I'm not saying you are in, but in the same type of culture. These are very well educated people. It is an ideology, and that ideology has a strategic objective, which is basically at this stage in history to weaken and defeat the United States as a prelude, as a first stage in basically reestablishing what they believe would be the caliphate, a caliphate which was an old notion that existed in history in the same way old religious empires existed in the West, is an institution that the jihadists would like to reestablish in modern times. And they feel that they are endowed, they feel that they are basically doing a legitimate action to bring back what was legitimate in their minds. Now, early 90s, collapse of the Soviet Union. The jihadist movements in the 80s were basically considering that the Soviet Union was the main enemy. Now, we could go on for hours as to why, but just to oversimplify, because in their analysis, the Soviet Union was communist, therefore atheist, and atheism and the norms of fundamentalism is more dangerous than another set of religious beliefs. So atheists would come first. Number two, because of the communists were more and better organized than the capitalists. And third, because many areas under communist control were Muslim, whereby these ideologies of fundamentalists, I would add several names such as either Salafi, Jihadi Salafi, or others, considered that it is more important to bring down the Soviet Union first than to turn against the other, what they call infidel forces. Because of that, in the 80s, and we have had this in the debate for many years now, especially last year, many said, you see, you Americans were the allies of these Salafi Wahhabi jihadists. And now you've turned your back when Afghanistan was liberated from the Soviets. Well, you have two ends to this equation. It's not that America does or moves into one direction then into the other direction. The Salafi themselves, exist, and they have their own ideology and they have their own policies. For example, the same scholars, religious scholars, radical religious scholars, who've developed the idea of jihad against the United States, explain to their own people, it's in the literature, that yes, we can use the resources of infidels. And by infidels, they mean not just non-Muslim Christian and Jews, but also Muslims who do not abide by their doctrine, kuffar, various shades of kuffar. We can use the resources of infidels against other infidels, which explains in their perspective how they became, i.e. the Mujahideen, the allies of the United States against the Soviet Union in the Afghan war. Now, the Soviet Union collapsed. They produced an analysis which is now that the Soviets have collapsed, and I'm quoting, almost translating, and we were in the right path of history, and Allah was satisfied with what we did, and therefore now we're going to engage the other kuffar or infidel powers. So it was a deliberate action, not just a reaction by the fact that they were allies at first. There was a debate in the community of the scholars who promotes jihad. Some said, we need to continue the battlefields of jihad in several spots around the world. Kashmir, Chechnya, Palestine, Philippines, Indonesia, Sudan. Some even spoke of Bosnia, but the international intervention was too heavy in Bosnia. So you have those who were transnational jihadists and said, we're going to engage in jihad, but we are going to have our bases in any place which is secure. One of these places that were secure in the eyes of the jihadists was the United States. Hence, in the end of the 80s, at the end of the 80s and early 90s, many networks of the jihadists operated in the West, including in the United States. That was a deliberate strategy. It was not that they chose the United States, because they knew that the safest place on earth that would protect them from the dragon, quote unquote, would be the belly of the dragon. So establishing the fundraisers, I'm sure you've heard of a lot of these cases where either allegedly or certainly there were fundraising organizations and other organizations that took the United States as a base for their action while the jihadist operations were taking place in several spots around the world. That's one school. The other school, the Osama bin Laden school, which I call the international jihadists, said, now that we were able to defeat the Soviet Union, it's like almost cartoonish. We defeated Ivan, the soldier, the Soviet soldier in Afghanistan, and suddenly the whole Soviet Union collapsed. If you are in 1989, you would see that the same way. Well, the Soviets were defeated in Afghanistan. Immediately after, the entire Soviet Union collapsed. So conclusion, by jihadist logic, which is not an economic Marxist logic, said we abided by what was a strict adherence to Salafism or jihadism, and we defeated the biggest empire on earth, that was the Soviet Union. So if we do the same with the United States, we will get to victory. Now, this is a logic by itself. We cannot question that logic with ours. Otherwise, you have to be equipped with the understanding of why is this logic, and understand the history behind it, and understand a lot of ingredients, which unfortunately we were very, very weak in the United States in terms of teaching it, researching it. That's why first question the public, why do they hate us? Who are they? What was their plan? So on and so forth. So it was in the early 90s, a deliberate move on behalf of those who formed Al-Qaeda that I distinguish really from those jihadists who fought on different battlefields. And there were debates. One of the most notorious debates took place actually on Al Jazeera after 9/11 between those two types of intellectuals. One said, we were not prepared for a war against the United States. And the other said, no, the opposite. By engaging the United States, we have been able to recruit thousands and thousands of mujahideen around the world. Now, look at this debate, analyze it, and then look at our debate that says, oh, we went to Iraq, therefore the jihadists existed. Therefore, they just woke up and then marched along to Iraq. We have a different perspective as to what is the real history of the jihadist movement. We are probably 12 to 14 years behind the real understanding of how Al-Qaeda, the other allied organizations have progressed throughout the 90s into making the final decision of attacking the United States mainland. Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden had developed their own perception of the weaknesses of the United States. They have tested the system in 1993 as a result of the bombing in New York, and saw what and how we basically reacted to, in the ways we reacted. And then in 1998, there was a declaration by Osama bin Laden in February of 1998, a declaration of war. A 29 minutes long speech nowadays, if Osama bin Laden will show up on Al Jazeera or on some videotape or audio tape, everybody is on the networks talking about it and talking about his health. Where is he? More so than about what he's talking about. At the time, 29 minutes of Osama bin Laden full health on Al Jazeera, declaring war, basically against America, full-fledged in Arabic, in clear Arabic. Now, that speech did not have any impact here because it was before 9/11, because our public was not basically trained to understand that this would be a threat. It had probably few lines in the New York Times. There were some considerations in the intelligence community. If you remember from the findings of the 9/11 Commission, Mr. Clark and others said, well, we were getting this information. I mean, this was not a secret. It was in the open. But our analysts were not able to figure out what it meant, not in terms of linguistics, but in terms of intention, strategic intent. Are they serious about that? Are they just marginal people? That is the maker and the breaker of a national security decision. If you have someone with a speech declaring war against you, us, now what would you make out of this? If you analyze it as a text, and our scholars will come and say, well, this is not representative of what really is the ideology of Salafism. This is not representative of what really is the ideology of Wahhabism. You're going to end up advising government and its agencies and its foreign policy to minimize your perception of the threat. So it's really the task of the intellectuals, of the academics, not just somebody sitting behind a desk to make a decision. You want to make sure that this is a strategic historic threat, or this is the product of a current of thought which is dying, which is marginal, which is not going to influence, which is not going to recruit among the communities where they are. We were blind as to the power, the influence of these ideologies in the communities they basically came from. After that, in the summer of 1998, there were the strikes against the embassies. And Osama bin Laden told us, I am declaring war against you, and I am calling on my mujahideen to strike against you. You meaning, as I said, Americans, Jews, Muslims who are not following that line, so on and so forth. And he did in August of 1998. Now let me stop 1 second as to analyzing our reaction, although this has been the subject of long discussions. And from that, draw the state of mind in which we were as a nation, as a foreign policy establishment, on the eve of 9/11. There were reactions, obviously. The government reacted. It bombed in Sudan. I'm not going to go into the details of the geopolitics and the military reasons, because that would take us into another realm, which is not of tonight's subject. But there was another strike in Afghanistan. The Taliban were a regime which basically protected Al-Qaeda. So all the scenarios that existed after 9/11 existed before 9/11. The military and the various agencies, the policy planners, proposed to the administrations then, at the policy level, a plan. I mean, and it was very clear. Either you want to engage Al-Qaeda and eliminate this organization by basically proceeding with a regime change. Removing the Taliban is a regime change. Or we're going to continue to wait for the next strike by Al-Qaeda. Political decision was, based on all the considerations of foreign policy, was we cannot do a regime change at the time. And that was the worst regime in the region, the Taliban, despite all the human rights abuses, despite everything that we now know about. The Holy Ghost said we cannot proceed with a regime change because it's in the findings of the 9/11 Commission. This would lead us to complications in international relations. Now, quote and underline this sentence. You will find this sentence everywhere. Everywhere in the United States before 9/11 wanted to do, beyond a police-based, intelligence-based reactions, you have this magic concept of this would lead to complications in international relations. Previously to that, now I'm going to link a little bit to Iraq, and then I will move completely to the conflict in Iraq. 1991. 1990, Saddam Hussein invades Kuwait, breaching all international laws, every single international law, including the way he managed his occupation in terms of human rights abuses. We reacted, obviously, because Kuwait, not just because there's a huge Kuwaiti lobby in the United States, because it was a huge place for oil. And definitely that gave us a lot of reasons to intervene massively and have this largest coalition ever. Remember last year in the debates, the presidential debates between those who promoted international direct intervention and those who promoted the build-up of international coalitions as an argument for intervention. Well, that was the biggest intervention based on coalition ever since World War II. You had everybody on. You had the French fighting, not just talking, and you had the Germans financing, the Russians were not vetoing, even the Saudis, the Egyptians, even the Syrians, the clone party of the Ba'ath was on board. So this international coalition basically was a success. We moved the Ba'athists out of Kuwait, and by logic of international relations, if a regime commits these kinds of crimes against international relations, with all what has followed in Kuwait, had basically perpetrated similar crimes against its own people back in 1988 in Halabja by gassing the Kurds and then gassing the Iranians, the whole thing. The logic under international law was that you sanction that regime after he has invaded Kuwait completely. That would have been the case if Haiti would have invaded Santo Domingo. Of course, you would go there and remove that regime. That's what we did, actually, for lesser reasons. In 1995, for example, 94, 95, we moved to Haiti and removed a regime because of abuse and human rights. There were no weapons of mass destruction in Haiti, nor links to Al-Qaeda that we know of. There was abuse of human rights, and there was a government which basically was a military government that has marginalized or uprooted another democratically elected government. These were the basis for an intervention in Haiti to reinstall, to basically change the regime. In Iraq in 1991, after the removal of the Ba'ath from Kuwait into Iraq, suddenly in the middle of the desert, our forces stop. Our forces stopped because we received the policy advice from Washington and from the region that yes, Iraq invaded Kuwait, but we cannot touch regimes in the Middle East because that will have complications in international relations. That would have effects in the region. Now, we will realize afterwards that those who gave us the advice as to not to go to Baghdad in 1991 with much lesser fatalities, and at the time where everybody was with us were representatives of regimes that basically feared that a change in regime in one spot in the Middle East is going to create what I call a tsunami of changes in the entire region. It is the spread of what will come after Saddam Hussein, not the fact that we would have been able to remove Saddam Hussein. There is a distinction here between the two notions. Removing Saddam Hussein is one thing. What will come after that removal is what many regimes in the region and ideological organizations were afraid of. And by the way, now historians are telling us that there were a lot of deals, many from Egypt and Saudi Arabia's higher sphere of influence told the United States then, if you find a nice high-ranking officer of the Ba'ath and we could do a nice coup d'etat in Baghdad, have him been in control, we will be fine with that. There is no problem. We don't need a regime change in the sense of uprooting a regime to replace it by a democratic institution, because that is very lethal. That would basically spread in the region. And we cannot do that because we will be the next on that list, which basically led to the stop of that campaign to remove Saddam Hussein in 1991. And the international community and the United States had to go through this long transitional time of boxing Saddam Hussein's regime into under no-fly zones, under sanctions, and then there was no exit strategy for the sanctions and the no-fly zones. Because he could have stayed, and he did, stay for about 10 years with no solution. Sanctions, basically, if not extended to the ultimate threat of removing that regime, and if he can sustain, and he did, all that pressure for all these years, it meant that there was no solution. It was a status quo. The end of the first war was a status quo which would have led to a crisis no matter what, under any president, under any administration, in any other context. That was a clock, that was an equation which was not finished. I wrote an article back in 1992, called it The Unfinished Symphony. Was it Beethoven? Or I made a comparison between ending a war with a solution whereby either that regime would be in conformity with international relations, international law, or you have to help the civil society of Iraq. At the time, when we had legality, when we had all that consensus to change the regime by its own strength at the time. Al-Qaeda attacked the United States because they felt long-term that the society here was ripe for a complete collapse. I made that statement before March of 2004. Wasn't understood. Then I made it again after March 2004. It was better understood because Madrid, meanwhile, took place, the strikes in Madrid. The initial perception of the strategy planners, if you want, of the jihadist movement was that the American society was ready for a reaction a la Madrid. There were three objectives in Al-Qaeda's mind, which are not secret. They are now available on the web. You could go and read any of these websites and you will see them clearly. One, Osama bin Laden projected by himself that there will be a political chaos as a result of these strikes, if these strikes would kill tens of thousands of people, of the magnitude of a non-conventional weapon. And if some among you may remember his unauthorized video which appeared in our networks, whereby he was talking to the guy on his left and on his right saying, well, I imagine there will be 20,000, 30,000 casualties, which is basically the result of the detonation of a non-conventional weapon. That was his original perception. And do remember, ladies and gentlemen, that in 1993, the first attempt against the two towers was an attempt with no survivors. Remember, the truck was in the basement. It wasn't a plane that was going to hit. It was a truck, which aim was to destroy the one building, to topple the other building, and the result will be everybody, tens of thousands. There was a repeat. Obviously, they weren't able to do the same because once you strike one time, the second strike will have to be different qualitatively and quantitatively. The first objective was huge casualties leading to mass political chaos. Now, it's difficult to project, but what they have expected would happen is mass demonstrations against the government in general, putting a lot of pressure to withdraw American forces, including the 12 task forces that we have deployed constantly around the world, so that the jihadists in these areas will basically be able to have the upper hand against either the regimes or in their areas of development. Number two, he expected that there will be a higher level of backlash against Arabs and Muslims in this country. I mean, a planification, a planning that would lead to a higher level of either persecution or pressure against a community is basically, in plain English, is a beginning of instigation of internal strife in this country. Now, it is not done for the pleasure of doing it. It is done because of the strategy. The weaker is a society on the inside, the less likely their government will be able to act outside in the greater realm of international relations. Thirdly, to instigate, to trigger a United States massive, uncontrolled, irrational reaction around the world after such emotional experience, carpet bombing, mass destruction. That was the initial objective of the 9/11 operation. Now, evidently, it wasn't so successful. It planted the seed, but wasn't so successful. The reaction was, obviously, as you remember, the removal of the Taliban. And after the Taliban's removal and Al-Qaeda defeat in Afghanistan, and I'm going to come closer now to Iraq, finally, there was the biggest debate, our biggest debate. What to do after that? Well, we've done Tora Bora. So after that, what would be the next stage? There are two schools. One school says, well, after that, we're going to go after the terrorists wherever we're going to find them with the widest coalition possible. Bring them to justice. The counter school said, and these are not political parties, these are just school of thinking in counterterrorism. The second school says, if we go after one cell or 10 cells, dismantle them, by the time we do that, 20 cells would have been created by the same factory. So logically, what we need to do while fighting the war against terror is winning another war. By winning this other war, we will be basically winning the war on terror, and that is the war of ideas, the war of ideologies, which now we start hearing about. Meaning, let me use a very simple discourse to explain it, and probably this would shed some light as to what is ahead of us. These ideologies are not descending upon us from out of space. They are produced within societies. So they have a socio-economic, cultural, historical, ideological background. If we fight the product of these ideologies, i.e. the jihadists, we would be basically engaging these ideologies to produce even further cells. That's the bad news. The more you fight, the more you're going to produce them. You're going to find out in these civil societies, this is pretty theoretical, but I'll come to the examples now. You're going to find out how you can induce these societies, not basically do it on their behalf, induce these societies, the good cells of these societies, to produce the antidote to these terrorist ideologies. That's what I propose for our discussion. That's my conclusion in my entire research. That is how a war against terrorism will be able to be ended, actually. And that is not an issue of 1 year and 2 years. It's an issue of a generation. Let me put it that way. All these wave of terrorists, or at least from the mid-'80s through the '90s to now, till now, which have been pounding the institutions in their countries and in the West, are being produced by, some call them the madrasas. I call it the educational system, which basically is designed to inculcate or invest intellectually in the minds of these people long term. So what the international society will have to do is to find a way to establish an alternative educational system. Not just to establish it, to trigger in these societies people who are ready to do it. So now we come to what after Tora Bora. After Tora Bora, the campaign is that the international community, of course with the United States, with its resources, could establish an alliance with the democratic forces in the Middle East, the greater Middle East, a strategic alliance with the democratic forces of that wider Middle East, so that they could together be able to produce a political culture that would give an alternative choice to young men and women who would be basically the soldiers of these totalitarian or terrorist ideologies. Now let's put this aside and address the issue in Iraq. And I know that Iraq has been the mother of all debates among us for the last 2-3 years now, with, of course, the elections as a benchmark. I don't want to discuss the reasons that took us to Iraq because they have been discussed enough. What I would like to do is look at the strategy of removing Saddam Hussein, regardless of the management or mismanagement of it, and see if this is working or not. I think that the most important question among ourselves here is less probably the debate that we had enough of, but I could give you my own analysis of it if in the Q&A's period you would want to. Now that Saddam Hussein was removed, and regardless of the fact of the timing, which I have a lot of questions about, of the way, which I have even more questions about, of the procedure and the alliances that were supposed, of the whole debate, regardless of the debate, Saddam Hussein's regime was removed. The question is, now in the media we call it, are we better off now than before? I don't want to go by what by how the media presents issues. The scientific academic question is, can Iraqi civil society produce a political culture and a political system which will be able to do two things? First, shield Iraq from the return of the Ba'athists or from the development of a Taliban-like regime in Iraq. That is crucial, because we're going to be spending our billions of dollars. We spent 80, we're going to spend more, another 80 in the future. Just about that, were we successful or not? But more important, will the Iraqi example, will these old women who went to vote with the blue ink on their fingers be an important example for all the other women, older and younger, in the region, that would basically encourage other societies to follow through with their own ways and procedures, is the biggest question. My answer is yes. My answer is yes because look, for example, at what, that's just one example. I know time is almost over. What the Al-Qaeda affiliates in Iraq tried to do over the year of 2004. Just go back and look at 2004 statistically, quantitatively and qualitatively. You'd see that Zarqawi, for example, I'm just giving one example, was on a race, tight race with Alawi, 2004. The Alawi government was trying to lead that prospect of democratization from one stage to the other under American occupation. The interim constitution, transfer of power in June, July of 2004, then deciding for elections, preparing the elections and doing the elections. Tomorrow will be the results. There will be the formation of an interim government, the election of a president, 2 vice presidents, the establishment of a cabinet based on coalition of political parties never seen before in Mesopotamia, not just in Iraq. And as a result of that, there will be, as you know, the constitutional discussion for the final form of the constitution and new elections. So that is one dynamic. The other dynamic was Zarqawi. Explosions, car bombs, killing, beheadings, threatening, engaging. First of all, of course, his discourse has changed from the struggle against American occupiers, fine. Then the struggle or the killing of the government that works with the American occupier. Then with the policemen and the judges and the journalists who work with the government, American occupiers. And then with the citizens who works with, so the stretch by Al-Qaeda's affiliates in Iraq of the enemy was going basically endlessly till the time where Zarqawi felt, and his networks of course, that civil society is going the other way around. Now of course in the Sunni triangle where he reigns with terror, he will have an impact on a large segment of this society. But in the rest of Iraq, Kurdish Iraq, Shiite Iraq, segment of the Sunnis who were against and are against Zarqawi, and now we're going to see more of those coming to government, there was another drive. Zarqawi said, anybody who's a candidate, I'm going to kill. The answer was 5,000 candidates. That's more than all the candidates of Turkey and Israel combined in any electoral process. That's significant. Never seen before. 5,000 candidates. I'm going to kill every voter. 9.9 million voters were registered. 8.2 million voted. I will be against every single organization that will be engaged in the elections. 150 political parties of all shades and ideologies, from the Communist Party to the Islamic Shia, and even now the Sunni, the milder Sunni fundamentalists or conservatives are joining. So what is this telling us? That regardless of our debate, our actual American debate, which is linked to our political system, the actual debate within Iraq was that at the first international opportunity to remove Saddam Hussein, you're going to get what we got. Not Sweden immediately or New Zealand. You're going to get a transitional society which is slowly but surely is going to engage in an Iraqi form of democracy. I am, as we speak, I mean, as I'm lecturing tonight and last night and tomorrow, about to finish my chapter in a series of textbooks that are now written in Arabic by Iraqis, by Arabs, by Middle Easterners, and by Americans who speak Arabic and write it, that would be destined to the next generation of Iraqi teachers. Long term, the changes that are taking place right now will not hold, will not be able to strategically function if they won't provide for civil society in all of Iraq, for example, the capability to produce a political culture, just an alternative. So I am among those who are writing or helping in writing textbooks on civil education, on political science 1001, that will be provided to teachers, about 3,000 to 4,000 teachers in Iraq, to engage in education, mass education of youth. Every single day I meet Iraqis here in Europe and elsewhere who are extremely, extremely excited about moving forward. They do understand that we had a debate, but their conclusion is they had one historic opportunity out of which they were able now to be developing their own democracy, and with all the problems that comes with it. And finally, will this impact other nations? Obviously it is. It's not even a question of will it. It already is. Reformists in Syria are surging now. The opposition in Lebanon, after what they saw in Iraq, students in Iran, women's movement elsewhere. Will this also excite the fundamentalists elsewhere to fight further? Absolutely. I mean, the fundamentalists don't need examples, don't need encouragement. Wherever they can, they will try to reestablish their form of government. My conclusion, since I've taken 60 minutes now, and then I will be more than happy to address any question, is that this one region in the world, from Morocco to Afghanistan, was the probably last region, with the exception of China, that has its own dynamics, which was not given a chance to reach freedom, liberty, democracy, and move forward. Look what was our policy with South Africa. We've helped. Our policy with Latin America. Whenever we could, we abandoned the military regimes. In Central Europe, Western Europe, Eastern Europe, there was a policy basically of support to the dissidents. From Lech Walesa, when he started under the 80s, in the 80s till about the collapse of the Soviet Union. Even we talk human rights with China. There was one region in the world that we basically abandoned to its own status quo. Remember our debate even on campus. Do not touch only that region. Touch Haiti. Do not touch that region, meaning do not engage its democratic forces in any sort of dialogue or in any sort of incentive to move forward. Why? Now, I want to leave you with this question. In my sense, the answer is one word. It starts with O and ends with L. I don't know if you have an answer. It starts with O. Well, you got it, oil. It is my conclusion with my last 20 years of research, especially after 1973, that the oil powers, the oil regimes in that part of the world have basically, with that huge amount of wealth accumulated quickly in about 20 years, shielded their not just their countries, but the whole region from any interaction with the outside world, any interaction from civil societies that would basically allow them to move forward towards democracy. All other regions moved to democracy except this one, and that was because of the protection of the political economy of oil. Having said that, I will finish here. Thank you very much for having the patience. And I will take the questions, starting with the gentleman.
Yes, I want to begin at the end of your talk, because I think the end of your talk was the most important point you made. And unfortunately, the talk didn't deal with that point, which is oil. The problem really isn't Islam. The problem really isn't jihadists, as you can try to argue. The problem is oil. And the failure, what we're dealing with right now, is the failure to address the problem of oil, which this particular regime in the United States is the least equipped to recognize, because of all the obvious reasons we can imagine. So it strikes me that the goal of democracy is noble. But unless there is a fundamental reappraisal of energy policies within this country and a fundamental reorganization of the sources of energy, none of what you are talking about and none of what has been done to this point will have any effect whatsoever. Because the oil, the politics of oil will remain strongly in place and the situation will not change.
Thank you. Anybody else would like to either, thank you, ask a question or make a statement, please? Yes.
What part does the Israeli-Palestinian situation play in this issue?
More specifically, which issue?
Well, I'm asking, is it basic or is it the fundamentalist Islam? And what is it?
It is a fragment. The material is basic. It's a fragment of the material, meaning, to answer the question which was raised on many campuses in this nation and by many think tanks over the past 20 years, that is, if you solve the Arab-Israeli conflict, you would basically be living in peace in the Middle East. Or had we solved the Arab-Israeli conflict, 9/11 would have happened. I counter that with all respect, because that is a piece of the much wider conflict that exists in the Middle East. And I just tried to hint in the beginning of my remarks that the jihadist movement existed before Israel, before the discovery of oil, to start with. That's a very long, and that's what the jihadists state. I cannot make the jihadists state what they don't want to say. I mean, if they wage a war, saying that the war basically is against the kuffar, you know, with all my respect to all the geniuses that have developed the other theories, I cannot say, well, the jihadists mean something and want something else. The Arab-Israeli conflict is central in the solution to the Palestinians and Israelis. And I was on Al Jazeera, asked the same question a few months ago. And I was a little bit radical in my answer. I said, fine. Let's suppose that we just take Israel as is, remove it physically, as Stalin used to do, and send it back to where it came from. That's what many of the jihadists would love to see happening. So what? Then what will happen? Will basically the problem of Sudan with the genocide of the black people in the south will stop? We'll find a solution to this? Will the Kurds will be able to be enabled with a homeland? Will women will be liberated? Will Lebanon will be liberated from Syrian occupation? Will the Ba'ath regime will become more human? I mean, it could go forever. That approach, saying that everything is caused because of the Arab-Israeli conflict, was even answered by the Palestinians themselves by electing Mahmoud Abbas. They have been suffering, of course, because of the Israeli occupation, but also because of the fact that the Arab regime since 1947 refused to establish a Palestinian state on a piece of a Palestinian land, because that would have been the beginning, the signaling of the movement for change in the entire Arab world. If you solve the Arab-Israeli problem, you're going to start looking at the other issues in the Arab world. So what will be the strategy of the regimes? Not to solve the Arab-Israeli conflict. Every time Israelis and Palestinians came close to solve that, who would be sinking it? One suicide attack against one target here or there, inviting the Israeli massive retaliation, and the problem would be more remote. Now Mahmoud Abbas is trying, in my sense, to come as close as possible to strike a deal. I don't see the final solution coming very soon. But this is an example as to when the peoples of the region themselves would decide as to how to solve it, they would. Iraqis are taking it in their own hands, Palestinians in their own hands, Lebanese in the next elections in May, hopefully, in their own hands, so on and so forth.
I think your analysis is very good, but your solution, I doubt. It sounds too academic and idealistic. It's hard to accept in light of the fact that Muslim fundamentalism, the belief in the purity of the Quran and all this accretion is so deep. It's hard for me to picture it's going to evaporate. How do you handle it?
Yes, if you see it in one dimension, in plain, in one book, of course, you have to look at it from a multi-dimensional perspective. Meaning, we have two ends in the state. I mean, want to be very, very quick. In one end that says, whatever we do there, if we don't do a regime change here, we're not going anywhere. I respect that. And the other end that would say, whatever we do there, even if we have a regime change here, it's not going to change because we cannot proceed in the change of Islam as a religion. I respectfully am in the center. I don't think that we have to be on those two extremes. I believe that civil societies in these regions, which are the most important factors in the game, we are important here. Our views are important, but the most important ones would be what they want to accomplish. I see that modestly, these civil societies, if equipped, if given the best of our policies, and I agree, we are not at the best of our policies, I think they can produce the alternative. I think modestly what's happening in Iraq, in Palestine, and soon to be in other spots is the beginning of it. Not it, the beginning of it. Yes?
What do you think of the United States policies towards Iran? How do you think that could negatively or positively affect Iraq?
Iran.
Yes.
First of all, we have to be very, very careful when dealing with Iran. This is a big nation with a lot of strength, resources, determination, an ideological regime which is very, very resilient. But at the same time, an analysis of the sociology of the Iranian people, and I don't know if there are Iranians among us today, but I have published a book on Iran a while ago. It's very indicative of the future. Long term, Iranian civil society will produce its own renaissance movement. It's going to happen. Now, to answer your question, it's about time. It's a question of time. If we leave it to Iranian civil society, 10, 20 years, they will come up with a solution to themselves. Why? Because if you analyze the student movement, this generation, the next one, youth, the cultures that exist there, their intellectuals abroad, and do the math, the sociological math, you will see that the mullah are going. I mean, the youngest generation, the student generation right now, which for the last 5 years have been very active, is the one that's going to be in power, in command, in the next 10 years. So the real question is, what should we do about it? Should we inject and help, as we did with South Africa and other places? Or should we not? This is a debate that we do here. The fear is really about security, international security. If we leave it to them, they're going to pay a higher price. They want to do that change. If we help civil society, we may shorten the time. My fear is that the Iranian regime will develop weapons of mass destruction, long-term and short-term projects, long-range delivery systems that would make our life more difficult in the future till we wait for the change coming from the inside. So the answer is a combined answer. You need to support the democratic movement in Iran on the one hand, make sure that the regime will not be able to produce, as I read this morning, in 6 months, weapons of mass destruction with delivery system, with an ally in Syria that has also delivery systems. The gentleman.
Thank you for your talk.
Thank you.
I just wanted to touch on, I'm glad that you brought up that the jihadists do have an ideology, and that is, the return to the pure and the glory of the Caliphate institution. While at the same time, the way we, as you know, the people who are in office today, or in the leadership of the United States, do somehow have an ideology of, I would label the jihadist ideology as a sort of like class of civilization. I mean, the clash of
civilization, yeah.
And Cheney and Rumsfeld are opponents of, Samuel Huntington's writings. How do you see that in terms of Bush getting up there, making the State of the Union speech and using the word crusade in there? At the same time, the civil society people you're talking about within the Muslim world somehow, and to some extent, do share that kind of jihadist view of the glory of the Caliphate institutions.
Yeah.
So, in terms of us combating that ideology and that belief and that recruiting, how do you see our role in terms of treating this not as, a clash of civilization, especially within our security, apparatus, by supporting, the strongmans of the Middle East, because we think, they share a different view than the jihadists. How do you see that, our role in terms of treating this as a clash of civilization instead of just ideology?
Okay, let me start with one point. It is imperative that whomever is in the White House and Congress and elsewhere, whomever, does not treat this as a clash of civilization, offering the other side of that civilization to the fundamentalists. Because if we follow through and say, this is a clash of civilization, you're going to give all the arguments to the fundamentalists on the other side to say, see, they say this is a clash of civilization, see, they're talking about crusaders and so on and so forth. Having said that, there was a problem here in terms of how civil societies in the Middle East look at Washington. Yes, there should have been here a humanist, progressive, I don't want to call it left-wing, liberal support to these civil societies that would have basically taken the issue much farther in time, and basically they would have been able to help these civil societies years ago. It didn't happen. The concern of civil societies in the Middle East is this, to be direct and honest about it. What is left-wing in the Middle East, what is liberal in the Middle East, what is progressive in the Middle East is fighting against dictatorship. It's fighting against the Saddam Hussein's, the Mullah regime, the Taliban regime. I mean, every single women's movement, any kind of freedom movement is fighting against these regimes. Now, where is the help coming from? It's coming from a West. The United States is leading force of the West, where conservatives, or neoconservatives we're going to call them, are the ones who are leading that movement to reach out to them. So yes, a neoconservative movement out of the United States is reaching out to progressive forces in the Middle East. It is not normal. But it's because, in my sense, the progressive forces in the West, both in Europe and in the United States, have abandoned them. I mean, I'm going to be very clear about it. How would the red buses go to Iraq to stand and protect the buildings of the Ba'ath Party are going to look now in front of the progressive and liberal forces of Iraq that are emerging after the elections? This is going to be a major crisis. The Communist Party was fighting against Saddam Hussein. The socialists were fighting against Saddam Hussein. The liberals, the women's movement in those countries. The equation is basically non-ideological anymore. It's about forces in the West that wants to provide a solution for these forces of liberation in the Middle East. And the trap in the United States is that the more progressive in the 80s and the 90s, unfortunately, did not take that lead. Sudan. Is it normal that Sudan would suffer for about 10 to 15 years, about 1 million casualties? Slavery will take place. And that throughout those 10 and 15 years, most human rights organizations or progressive organizations were not siding clearly and marching with the Southern Sudanese until the Southern Sudanese cause broke in America. And now there is a beginning of humanist, human rights, democratic movement to sustain them. So it was a strategic problem on behalf of, I consider, the democratic and the human rights progressive forces in the West. Yes.
I question 90% of what you said this evening, but I'm not here to debate you or speak to you. Firstly, you talk about Sudan. What about Rwanda?
Yeah.
I mean, because it's not a Muslim country, we don't mention it. We shouldn't just say that there are atrocities occurring in Muslim countries only. We have supported most of the dictators in the Middle East. We were the ones that gave Saddam the mass destruction weapons to use against his own people. We gave him the weapons to fight Iran for us. As this gentleman said, if there wasn't oil, we wouldn't care about them. Palestine is the key issue to all Arabs. Don't kid yourself or don't kid these students. The Arab regimes never wanted not to have a Palestinian state. When it was offered to them, it was 60% of the unique Palestine of what they knew. Why would they accept 60% of their own country? What about the right of return for the people? I, as a Muslim woman, do not think that the jihadists can tell me that I'm liberal or not liberal. My religion gives me my liberty. I don't need them to tell me. And if it is, it's cultural, it's not religion. I don't know where you get this jihadist movement. I mean, is it some kind of spider hanging around? I have lived in the Middle East. I have lived here. My children, my sister's children live in Saudi Arabia. And why would Americans go and write the books for Iraqis? Should the Polish people come and write our textbooks for us? I question, everything you say.
Everything, yeah.
Why do we have to impose our way of thinking, your thoughts on Iraq, on the Iraqis? Why can't they think for themselves?
Yes. Well, more of the same? Okay.
Comment on what you are saying. How is it a chance that we, the democracy-loving people, that want the people to determine their own destiny, we put the Shah in? We practically pick them up, and put him in power. And I think this mistake that we did, we had the mullahs come.
Yeah.
And hopefully that the mullahs will be, you know,
Moved aside,
that
yeah.
that the new generation will take care of. And then look at all the Arab world. At the top of every Arab world, what do you see? Government. What do you see?
Mm-hmm.
I'm asking your opinion. What do you see?
When you finish, I will start.
This is my question.
Okay, all right. No, I
What do you
finished.
see at the head of the government of each Arab country?
Okay.
And who is backing?
Okay. The equation that both of you ladies have mentioned, which I respect, of course, is the one that existed before 9/11 and before the current policy that exists now in the United States, that is to sustain its democracy. You may not be happy with it because the world has changed so suddenly. You were more comfortable, I assume, with what I've heard, with America being the imperialists, those regimes being the nationalists, we not intervening in the life. I'm trying to answer now. Now I'm trying to answer. All right. That has changed, meaning if you ask me 5 years ago to criticize American foreign policy, be my guest. I would have told you most of what have been happening in the Middle East, most of it was of the responsibility of the foreign policy. I mean, who asked the Syrians to basically stay in Lebanon and occupy Lebanon? American foreign policy. Who basically helped the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, the Madrasa, the Taliban? American foreign policy. I mean, I remember a National Security Council advisor, it was on CNN, by the way, going to the border between Pakistan and Afghanistan and telling the Mujahideen, yeah, fight for your land, but don't forget that this is also because of Allah. We actually fueled the Wahhabis and the Mujahideen in the region. There's no doubt about that. We installed the Shah, all of that I agree with you. What I'm trying to say is we're trying to guide now this new American foreign policy after 9/11 because the American public felt the weight of our mistakes in the past towards a better policy. Now I understand we may trust, some of the people do trust, some others do not trust, that this is a viable enterprise. I do feel, and we are, free citizens with different views here. I do feel that it's worth it, that there is a window of opportunity. Not because I want to encourage American control around the world, not at all. Because I see some ingredients of success coming either from Iran or from Iraq or from other societies, and I don't want to let them down. I don't want to let them down just because I am not happy with who's in the White House. I'm not happy with who's in the White House or who's in Congress. That's an American debate. But I would like to look at these civil societies and give them the chance. I am glad that France is coming on board on the issue of Syria and Lebanon. This is new. This is wiser than before. I am glad, for example, when it comes to Iraq, that we should be wiser in the future. We should, as soon as possible, withdraw from all the cities in Iraq and give it to the Iraqis. We should be smarter in dealing with Iran, 100%. So on the one hand, I agree with you. Your criticism I do espouse. But I'm trying to give some additional hope to civil societies that we can change in as much as they can do.
I'm still waiting, sorry, for my answer. And I will give you the answer. What I see at the head of each Arab country is a minority, either in thought or in religion or in background, that is controlling a majority, and this minority is a toy in the United States' hands. We, in our hand, put it or take it, and it is between two fires. One fire of
and the other
people, and one fire, if you don't do what we say, we will instigate the people against you. And then there is a live example, and it's not far in history, when in Algiers, a democratic voting and a democratic election took place, and we did not like the end result. What did we do?
Yeah, well, everything you say, I heard it. It's the dominant culture. I agree with you with one exception. You say all these regimes are ruled by oligarchic, etc. Of course. I am not sure that we control them. You know what? In my sense, they have controlled us with their oil, with their policy and influence. That's my view, which is your view. Actually, I am not sure who had controlled the others. Have we controlled them or they have controlled our foreign policy? I espouse us. We do have others, please, and then we'll come back. Please, gentlemen.
First of all, thank you. I want to start with an academic kind of statement. You started with a critique of the Middle Eastern Studies establishment in the United States, that you started with a critique of the Middle Eastern Studies establishment. I just want to say that that's a very narrow reading of what that establishment is.
Okay.
As you well know, I'm sure, Middle Eastern Studies in the United States is comprised of really many, many different fields, the studies of religion, the arts, and so on and so forth, most of which doesn't really get into the policy realm at all. Now, you may be right in your critique of some segment of that establishment, so to speak, which in your judgment did not read the 9th and coming of the 9/11 and so on and so forth. But just to be fair, that critique could not and should not be applied to
the rest.
Eastern studies in the US or in the West in general. Now, to come to your main point, I agree that, I agree with your conclusion that the best antidote to extremism, to jihadism, to fundamentalism, is to support democratic movements in these societies. The question is, how are we going to do that, right? I'm very glad that you used the term civil society, that is, strengthening civil societies in these countries. In that light, do you think that what has been done in Iraq, for example, has in fact strengthened the civil society? Is that the way to do it? Well, take Saudi Arabia, our most significant ally economically in the Middle East. But surely there is room for a civil society to develop there. And if you're going to talk about US policy in the region, certainly that should be one of the priorities, to promote the formation of the democratic, or to strengthen the democratic movements in Saudi Arabia and in Egypt, for example, another major ally. So I quite agree with your conclusion. As long as we are prepared to also accept that in many of these societies, if freedom in fact is given, the outcome may not necessarily be to our liking. What may emerge may not be a democratic, liberal society. And I think the example that was given about Algeria is a very apt one. It's entirely possible that at this particular juncture in the history of these societies, what may emerge is a kind of liberal Islamic regime, which I think we have to be prepared to accept. So, well, let me stop there.
Well, that's a very, very good, actually, reading of the challenges that exist. I am not here to propose this is an A to Z solution to all these problems, but the path. There is one path now which is developing, which I would hope that the talents of our Middle Eastern studies or of our youth around the nation and campuses would come to help. The major problem in the 90s, and I'm sure you've experienced that, was the problem was there, it was not recognized that it was, and not enough talents told us how to deal with civil societies, how to reduce the impact of fundamentalism. So I'm going to keep my answer very open. The challenge exists, but my choice for path would be to go ahead and do the experiment versus to wait for the experiment to happen. This is my summa divisio. Meaning, before 9/11, before this era, the idea was you leave them do their own experiments. And I've seen civil societies calling on us, what are you talking about? Why is it that when it comes to the white man of Europe, you would intervene? When it comes to areas that are outside the Middle East, you would intervene. You have failure or not. And when it comes to the Middle East, you won't help, you won't engage. That's the big question. And my answer is that we need to engage in the Middle East in the same way we engage elsewhere and have civil society producing the antidote, as I mentioned. Do we have time, or we're, I think?
It's 8:35, and so I think we will take one more question and then leave.
Okay. But you were going to make that decision because...
Yes,
yeah.
time, yeah.
Getting back to what you said about an antidote, don't you think it's time that the world recognizes some type of interreligious council that should represent people responsible with interreligious council of educators? Because in the United States, we have no respect or other religions, which basically is part of people's regular society, in political society. And don't you think it's time that even Americans get educated on this with responsible interreligious leaders?
I would see pros and cons in this approach. The pro is that having interfaith dialogue and interfaith dialogue as a concept, and I taught comparative religion, will help us in reducing violence and will help us in engaging. The other end, which is going to be a little bit risky, and we have to strike in between, is that if we say and state that all problems are because of religious theological debates, and if we solve those religious and theological debates, we'll be solving all other problems, then we will be equating every single crisis around the world based on religion only. And I think that will not provide us with the right answers on policy. What I would suggest is that do a dual policy at the same time. On the one hand, engage in religious dialogue, theological dialogue. On the other hand, equip civil societies with their own democratic powers to solve these problems, even outside religion. What if the rabbi and the priest and the sheikh would say, well, we agree on these issues and the other issues we're not going to agree on because theological determination. You have to leave some of these solutions to civil society solutions. So I would think a wise approach in foreign policy or world policy would be to undergo both. Inter-theological dialogue on the one hand and civil society support on the other hand. We're done. Thank you very much.